which is completely different. The research topic is completely different, and therefore, we are not really able to produce good research, in the country. So, what is important here that we have to really understand how to use the original sources for writing history. Now we have various sources. We cannot really depend only on one source. We have, for example, we have a lot of textual sources in the country, but unfortunately, the textual sources start, much later. We have some early sources like, maybe Rigvedic, text, Vedic text, etc., or epics, Ramayana, Mahabharata. But the problem with this is that what is the date of this? That is not yet clear, and therefore even though there is a plethora of knowledge available in that, sometimes we are not really able to use that knowledge or that source properly. Similarly, we have a lot of classical literature available, textual sources available, from the beginning of the historical period, roughly from 6th century BC onward. But still, there are a lot of problems, with that. Maybe I'll discuss with the, those problems later. But this is one important source that is available in the country. The second important source is now archaeological source, which is considered the more authentic source for writing history, because you have actual remains, and based on the remains, you try to reconstruct the history of the period. So that is very, very important source we have. Recently, also we have generated new source called genetic source. We want to understand about the people, and we have initiated that research in the country recently. And one more research that which we have begun, in fact, which we have begun in Deccan College, is the what we call as the craniofacial reconstruction. That is also very important. So maybe I will start with the slide, and I will try to explain the my presentation, in fact, with the help of the slides. Can you see my screen?
Oh, sir.
Yes.
Oh, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
It's very clear.
Okay, now let me begin. In fact, when we started writing our history systematically, I think from the time Asiatic Society was established on 15 January 1784 by William Jones. Now let me tell a little bit about William Jones also. William Jones, he came as a legal advisor to the Eastern India Company, and when he came here, he realized that that he started taking keen interest in Sanskrit language. And then when he started studying this language, he realized that there is a lot of similarity between the Gothic and the Sanskrit language. And then he thought that maybe the basic source of both the languages could be same. And that is how he developed a lot of interest, and he became a Sanskrit Pandit at one stage. So this is something that one should learn from people like William Jones. The second important event, I would say, in history writing, which is very oftenly overlooked, is the work done by Alexander Cunningham in 1940s. Now, what he did, this is a very important research methodology that he initiated, and unfortunately, that subsequently, this particular methodology was not properly adopted or followed by historians in the country. So, what he did, he used the textual sources, mostly the Buddhist literature, and also a lot of foreign travelers' accounts, which are found in Indian subcontinent. And he tried to locate the places mentioned in the literature, in the Buddhist literature, and also in foreign travelers' accounts. And he tried to locate some of the sites mentioned. So he started the field work, and he located nearly 25 sites based on textual sources. So this is how that he began systematic maybe documentation of the historical remains in the country. So that is a very, very important beginning. I think this is a very important source that we overlook or we neglect. Then in 1862, Archaeological Survey of India was established, and that the Archaeological Survey of India is the custodian of the Indian culture and heritage. They are the one, in fact, who are supposed to protect the heritage of the country, and also they undertake research on the Indian heritage and culture, and they have the presence almost all over the country, and they try to monitor the history, maybe direction in the country. Even they try to create the primary sources for history writing. So that is the main mandate of the Archaeological Survey of India. Then the important event happened in 1920s, with the discovery of the Harappan civilization. Now, before the discovery of the Harappan civilization, most of the historians and most of the people believe that perhaps this most of the developments in Indian subcontinent happened quite late. Most of the people thought that settled life happened in fact maybe around 6th century BC. There was nothing before 6th century BC in the Indian subcontinent. And Vincent Smith, who wrote that book on ancient Indian history. Now he has mentioned that there's a big hiatus or big gap in the history of South Asia, and he said that India jumped from Stone Age to the Stupa period or the Buddhist period, and there's a big hiatus in this between this Stone Age and the early Stoic period. But that so-called bridge, this gap was bridged with the discovery of the Harappan civilization. In fact, the excavation started at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. Both are now in Pakistan. And, the excavators took almost 4 years to identify the remains that they excavated. So on 20th September 1924, the director of the excavation, Sir John Marshall, he wrote the first article announcing the discovery of the Harappan civilization in Illustrated London News. So with that discovery, the so-called gap in the history of South Asia was bridged completely. And now India boasts of a continuous history for almost 2 million years, for 20 lakh years. The earliest stone tool discovered in Indian subcontinent is dated to around 20 lakhs, 2 million. And from 2 million to the present, we have a continuous history. And perhaps India is perhaps a unique country in the world where you can see such a continuity for almost 2 million years. This is a very, very important, feather, in fact, in the cap of the nation. Then, in 1950s, a very famous project was launched by B.B. Lal. It was called the Mahabharat project. Now, the importance of this project is from the point of view of research methodology again. What he did, he followed the footsteps of Alexander Cunningham. He also, tried to locate the important places mentioned in Mahabharata. For example, Hastinapur, for example, then Aishchatra, Indraprastha, Ayodhya. These are the places which are mentioned in Mahabharata. And on the basis of, little location provided in the text, he tried to locate the sites. So he located Indraprastha, which is Purana Kila area of Delhi. Then, the Hastinapur village, of course, is, very much there. This name is written even today. Aishchatra was located, and of course, Ayodhya is known. So, he followed the footsteps of Alexander Cunningham, but then he went one stage further, and he actually wanted to find out whether there is any trace of the Mahabharata period at these sites, because the sites have been mentioned in the text. So he carried out excavations at all the sites. Actually, Indraprastha, Hastinapur, and Ayodhya were excavated by Professor B.B. Lal, and the site of Aishchatra was excavated by K.N. Dixit. And what he found in fact at all these places, there is one culture which was common, and that was the painted graver culture, which he found present at all the 4 sites. And you know that the painted graver culture is the early Iron Age culture in North India, contemporary to the megalithic culture in South India. and it is dated between 1300 to 700 BCE in the Indian subcontinent. And he initially thought that Professor B.B. Lal thought that this is the culture which represents Mahabharat period. But then of course there is so much discrepancy between the actual evidence found at these sites and the description given in the text. In the text, there's a mention of flourishing cities and towns. There's a mention of maybe this offensive and defensive iron implements. We do not have that kind of evidence in the painted grave culture. In fact, painted grave is a very, very poor culture, represented by circular huts, very flimsy structures, very scarce presence of the iron implements, etc. So it did not match. So initially, though he thought that it is a culture which represents Mahabharat. Later, he had to withdraw his statement because of the discrepancy that he noticed between textual sources and the archaeological sources. What is important here that the conclusion is not important, but the methodology that he adopted, that is very important. And this is how one should really adopt the research methodology. Then as I say that we have a lot of textual sources starting from Rigvedic period, the date of which is fiercely debated. We do not know what is the date of Rigvedic period. We do not know what are the dates of the later Vedic periods, etc., later Vedic texts, etc. So though we have plethora of knowledge, information in these texts, we are not been able to use that information for writing history because of the paucity of the this particular aspect. Then the other drawback of the textual sources, though we have classical literature, we have a lot of maybe Periplus, we have Indica, we have Kautilya's Arthashastra, etc. And then of course a lot of other literature following that. So the problem with this literature that they do not talk about common people. They only talk about maybe aristocrat family, about the higher class, or about the ruling class, because most of the textual sources, they are created on behalf of the rulers, and they will certainly write good about the rulers. They will not write bad about the rulers. So that is the problem with the textual sources. We always find a lot of biased information in the textual sources. And therefore, even though we write history, we are not sure whether we have written the true history of that particular period or not. So that is the problem. Then we also have archaeological sources. Now we have, as I mentioned, that right from 2 million till maybe the industrial period, we have generated a lot of archaeological sources on different cultural periods. It is not that archaeologists only deal with those sites for which there is no written records, but archaeologists also deal with the sites which are historical for which there is written records. We also deal with medieval sites for which there is a lot of literature available, literary sources available, until we continue up to the industrial era. So we have maybe prehistoric archaeology, we have proto-historic archaeology, we have historical archaeology, we have medieval archaeology, and we have industrial archaeology. So we deal with all these different periods, cultural periods of the history till modern times almost. And then as I mentioned that we have also generated a lot of genetic sources now. We have begun this research at the site of Rakhigarhi, and this is a very, very important stage in the development of a new source in writing history, about which maybe I will talk a little bit. And one more research that we initiated at the site of Rakhigarhi is the 3D reconstruction of the people, how exactly the people looked like. So we have taken the specimens from the site of Rakhigarhi, and we have shown how the Harappan people looked like. So these are the different sources. Now, what is important here that as far as the textual sources are concerned, I think most of the historians, most of the archaeologists, they try to use the secondary sources. Very few of us try to go to the original source and try to find out, because a lot of these original sources have been translated by different historians. So we have they have created secondary source, and we mostly rely on the secondary source. And because of this, that the authenticity of the data that we have is not really fully assured, and therefore we always have doubts about the sources that we use. So we must make sure that we go back to the original source, try to decipher the original source, and use that source for writing history. Don't rely on the secondary sources. And because of this problem, you know, our publications do not find places in international journals or publications, and mainly because of the shortcomings in our research methodology that we adopt, and we must now correct that. Secondly, now the archaeological sources also are important, but again, you cannot depend entirely on archaeological sources when it comes to the historic period onward. So here, we have to synthesize the archaeological and literary sources to produce a true history of any particular period. And then, of course, you have to combine even genetic sources and craniofacial sources. Recently, I have written a paper on on the recent research and how we can combine this research or different sources for generating a new history of the country. Now that paper is published in Puratatva. Maybe I can share that with Professor Danish Moin, maybe, and that can be circulated also. So these are the limitations, in fact, and the lacunas, early textual sources. So there's a lot of heavy biasness in the writing of the history, and that biasness was first pinpointed by Dr. R.S. Sharma. Professor R.S. Sharma was a professor in Delhi University. He's a doyen of Indian history, and he is the one, in fact, who first experimented a new approach in writing history, and that was in 1980s. In fact, the classical book he wrote, Urban Decay, that is a real classical book that he wrote, and there he has shown that how we can combine different available sources for writing history. So for the first time, he synthesized archaeological and literary sources available in the country. He had chosen the period of the Gupta age for analyzing and maybe throwing new light on this particular period on the basis of his new research approach. Now, before 1980s, let me tell you that the history was so boring. You know, the history which I learned maybe 50 years ago, I taught the same history to my students, and my students are teaching the same history to their students. So nothing exciting was happening in the history, and same old maybe narratives was repeated again and again. So it was becoming bored. But after 1980s, in fact, R.S. Sharma made history writing very, very interesting. Unfortunately, till today, we are not following the path shown by Dr. R.S. Sharma, Ram Sharan Sharma, a very, very important research. So what he did, in fact, let me give you the example now, how he came to a different conclusion. We all read about the Gupta age as the golden age in ancient Indian history. All of you must have read that. So what he did, he wanted to check whether that golden age is also reflected in the archaeological sources also. So what he did, he studied two cultures intentionally: the previous Kushan culture or the Kushan age, and the Gupta age. And that most of the history of the Gupta period is written based on literary sources. A lot of literature was created, and the impression that we got from the literature is that it is a flourishing phase in the history of ancient Indian history. And there was also, Samudragupta also issued some gold coins. This Prayak Prashasti mentions about, the Samudragupta's conquered almost the entire Indian subcontinent, etc. So the hint given by the text was that it is a golden age, and that is how the histories, writing of the history is reflected. But then, he started studying the archaeological sources. He studied the archaeological sources of Kushan period and also of the Gupta period. And what he noticed was that now he was clear in his opinion that suppose it was a golden age, that should reflect in the archaeological data. So he first tried to understand how many sites are there in North India, because the core part of the Gupta Empire was in the Ganga plain, and also the Kushan also had their maybe core area in that region only. So what he noticed that there are large number of Kushan sites in Ganga plain, but comparatively there are small number of Gupta period sites. So this is a very, very important hint that got, and he said that he started asking question: if it is a golden age, why it is not reflected in the number of sites that are figured in pattern in North India? So he started asking question: is it a sign of a golden age? And his answer was no. It is not a sign of golden age. If it was a golden age, that should have reflected in large number of sites, which is not there. On the other hand, he found large number of Kushan sites. So this is a very good, important, marker that he came across. Then also he noticed that wherever there's a Kushan site, on top of that, the Gupta people have made their settlement. So there are very few, maybe a pure single culture Gupta site in the Ganga plain. Most of the sites are multicultural above the Kushan levels you find. Then some of the sites have been excavated. Both the periods have been excavated at some sites. The Kushan period and the Gupta period have been excavated. And what he noticed was a very rather disappointing note. What he noticed that Kushan people built large and rectangular structures. Very spacious structures were encountered. They were very well made. They also created their own building material in the form of bricks. So that is the kind of evidence, and all the structures were really very well laid out, very linear pattern, or well in a grid pattern, etc. When he compared the data from the from the Gupta levels, he was surprised because there are very small structures in the Gupta period. They are mostly very flimsy structures, not very well made structures like you find in the Kushan period. Secondly, the Gupta people have not made the building material on their own. They knew that they are sitting on top of the Kushan levels, and they knew that there are structures below. So what the Gupta people did, in fact, they dug into the ground, and they took out the bricks from the Kushan levels, and they used these bricks for constructing their own structures. So here also, R.S. Sharma was baffled. He said that this is not a sign of a golden age. And also then he compared the material culture, the terracotta art, the presence of jewelry, the type of technology that was available that time. And he said that that Kushan period was much more advanced, and they are the real people who can claim to be a golden age period in the ancient Indian history. So his final conclusion was that Gupta age was not a golden age in Indian history. If at all there was a golden age, it should be Kushan and not Gupta period. So maybe we may not agree with his conclusions here, but what is important that he is the scholar who for the first time synthesized the archaeological and literary sources for writing history. This is very, very important. Then, of course, I come to archaeology or to the history part. Now we follow either traditional history or traditional archaeology, or we follow maybe processual archaeology. This is more or less part of the traditional archaeology or traditional history. And then up to 1960s, there was a change, in fact, in the methodology that was suggested and adopted. And that from 1960s onward, it is called the new archaeology or post-processual archaeology. There are two pioneers in this respect. One, of course, from Cambridge University. His name is David Clark. And the other one, his counterpart in USA, America, was Louis Binford. So Louis Binford is the one who propounded the concept of new archaeology, and he called this as new archaeology. Whereas his counterpart in Cambridge, he called this as a post-processual archaeology, and it was followed by Ian Hodder and other scholars in Cambridge. So what is the difference between traditional archaeology history and and new or the post-processual archaeology and history, the traditional historians, traditional archaeologists began to ask questions like what happened in the past. So they only concentrated on reconstructing the past events. So different events were reconstructed. They say that this protohistoric phase was from this period to this period. These are the characteristic feature of the protohistoric period. The historical period starts from this date, and these are the characteristic feature of the historical period. This is the medieval period, or the characteristic of the medieval period. Like that, these different events were reconstructed by the traditional or processual historians and archaeologists. Whereas for the first time, the new archaeologists, they began to ask question why this particular event has happened. And when you ask the question like why it happened, so naturally you have to then bring into a lot of new approaches. You have to adopt a lot of new approaches because you have to explain. So here what they did, what happened in fact, they generated a lot of data. This new archaeologists or historians, they created a lot of primary sources in this respect. Then in the second stage, they started classifying the sources into different categories. In the third time, place, in the third stage, they started analyzing the data. That in archaeological sites, generally we get two kinds of broad categories. One is called what we call as the artifact. Anything that was made and used by man is called artifact. So we get artifact, and the other category that we get in archaeological records is what we call as ecofact. These are the organic remains, maybe food refuse, animal bones, maybe botanical remains, all this different which was not considered as a valid data by the traditional archaeologists or historians. Now the new processual archaeologists, post-processual archaeologists, they thought that this is equally important as the artifact we find in the excavations. So then they started analyzing this artifacts and ecofacts. So there in fact they brought in a lot of new aids. They took help of other sciences. They took help of botany, zoology, chemistry, physics. You name any science, either it is a hardcore science or maybe social science. All these approaches of different sciences, they were taken into consideration, and they were taken the help was taken from these different sciences for the analysis of the data. That is very, very, very important. And because of that, now we can shed light on number of different facets which was not possible in the traditional approach. And then of course the new archaeologists, historians, post-processual archaeology historians, they also realized the importance of the ethnographic data. Louis Binford, who has worked extensively on the hunter-gatherers. So he spent nearly 20 years in with the Eskimos in the Antarctica region, and he documented all the processes of the hunting gathering that these people follow, and that information was used by him for reconstructing the life of the Stone Age people. Because we are at a very disadvantageous position as far as the data is concerned in the prehistoric period. We either find maybe mostly stone tools. These are very, very blind stone tools, and they are not, they're mute. In fact, they do not really speak. And if you are lucky, sometimes we get ecofacts in the form of maybe fossilized bones, or maybe fossilized maybe wood, etc. But that is very rare. So from these stone tools only, it is very difficult to reconstruct maybe their hunting strategy, or what type of animals were hunted by them, their maybe gathering strategy, what type of plants were collected by these people, etc. So there we can use a lot of ethnographic data, And there is a separate branch now called ethnoarchaeology in this particular field. So India, even though we are backward to some extent, because Europeans particularly thought that we are backward because we are living in villages. But there's a boon in disguise, because there are a lot of communities in India today, or in South Asia in general, who are technologically in different cultural periods. Still, we have hunter-gatherers. Still, we have primitive, maybe farmers. We have, a lot of, maybe craft specialization. They use the traditional knowledge system even today, and they produce their craft. So that is the advantage we have. So if you want to reconstruct the life of the hunter-gatherers, you study the modern hunter-gatherers, use the data for the reconstruction. You want to study, maybe Neolithic, Chalcolithic lifestyle, you use the, data on the early farming communities or the primitive farmers in the country, use that data for reconstruction lifestyle of the people. So there is so much impact. Now we have so much impact in the country or South Asia, which can be used. And then finally the interpretation is very important. The interpretation can vary from maybe scholar to scholar, but that stage is also important, a very important stage in the research maybe step. And finally we have to come to the proper conclusion. So unless we use all this data together, all the sources together, unless we start asking different questions like why these things have happened, and then of course this it leads us to many sub branches or maybe subsystems, etc. So that is happening. So this is the importance of this new archaeology. Louis Binford visited Deccan College in 1986, and in fact, we had a very good interaction with him that time. So we asked him, what is the approach that he adopted, and he said that you have to spend a lot of time in the field. You have to keep observing and keep recording this. And he said that don't develop the hypothesis or model before you have data. He said that collect data first, and based on the data you develop your model and hypothesis. So this is the difference between both in fact David Clark and Ian Hodder, Louis Binford. Now both of them had more or less same approach. They say that before you start any excavation or any research, you have to formulate a hypothesis. This is what Binford has suggested. Whereas David Clark also wanted to suggest the same thing, but he said that you have to develop a model for your research. So both are same in fact. Hypothesis and model are same. But then he also explained in fact, which we followed in fact, how the hypothesis is built. What is the criteria that we use for developing hypothesis? Because the hypothesis is based on merely surface collection and not based on the excavation. So it was suggested that two things are very important. If you want to develop a hypothesis, you consider two important things. One is that study the site in great detail. Take the measurements of the site, find out what is the thickness of the site, etc. How long the site was under occupation, and what is the nature of the data lying on the surface. So based on that, you make a detailed documentation of this. And then next stage is that you study the area around the site, maybe 5 kilometers or 10 kilometer area, and try to find out what are the natural resources available in the catchment area, area around the site. Then what is the climate available, around the site? What is the soil type available, around the site? And then based on this, you can develop a hypothesis. So I'll give one example how we have done that. I studied two important sites. One is the site of Inamga, which is a Chalcolithic site, and quite extensive site. It was spread over an area of roughly 6 hectares, quite a big site that way in the Deccan region. And the other site we studied was the site of Valki, which was roughly 20 kilometers away from Inamgaon. And, we, on the basis of the surface collection, we wanted to formulate a hypothesis about the function of these two sites. So we studied the, surrounding ecological conditions, the ecology, geography, geology of the sites around the sites. And we found that, both the sites, Inamgaon and Valki, they are surrounded by very good agricultural land, very good arable land. Then, also we found that there is enough, maybe water sources available around the site. There are enough natural resources available around the site. So since, the dominant part was the arable land, agricultural land around the sites, both the sites, we thought that, this agriculture was the main occupation at both the sites. And then, we studied the sites in great detail. We found that Inamgaon is a very large site. It has got almost, 3-meter deposit, quite thick deposit that way. And it was, very extensive site. So we thought that this is a permanent settlement. And here, we expect maybe rectangular or permanent structures at the site. And then, when we studied the site of Valki, it was found out that, the site of Valki is hardly half a hectare in size, very small in size. And the deposit here is not more than 50 centimeter, hardly 50 centimeter. So it indicates that perhaps, the site was occupied by a small number of people, group of people. And since, it has a very thin deposit, that means the site was not permanently occupied. Probably the people here were semi-nomad in nature. So either they came here in particular season or they stayed here for a very short duration. So this is how the hypothesis was built. And then we say that Inamgaon is a agricultural village, whereas Valki is a farm state where agriculture also was practiced, in fact, was the main occupation. But it was a farm state of some big village. And the nearest big village, of course, was Inamgaon. So we thought that, this is a farm state of Inamgaon. And then we actually carried out excavations at both the sites. At Inamgaon, we found permanent structures, very well made floors of the structures. The fireplaces were, heavily used. And we have found, the various craft manufacturing activity at the site. Whereas at the site of Valki, we found only circular structures, very flimsy structures. No floor was, well made. The fireplace was hardly burnt. It was located outside in the open. That means people have not lived there in rainy season. And that we have no evidence of any permanent structure or feature there. Probably people came here from Inamgaon. They stayed here in fact, during the for carrying out agricultural operations. And after the agricultural operations are over, they went back with the food grains they produced to Inamgaon. So this is how that the hypothesis provided us some direction. And this is very important that you develop the hypothesis or model first and then try to look for the evidence. So you get some proper direction in this respect. There is a criticism perhaps if you get evidence which goes against your hypothesis, that evidence is likely to be neglected. That is bound to happen also. But it happens very rarely. So there are more advantages than disadvantages. Therefore it is suggested that we follow this particular procedure in our research. And then of course we also took help of various sciences. Inamgaon was the first site where we actually introduced some new methods of collection, new methods of analysis of the data, archaeological data, artifacts and ecofacts. And because of that, we were able to reconstruct the society, the economy of those people, even though we did not have written records of that particular period. Based on material culture, it was possible for us to develop or build the social society of that particular period. So, this is how, the research methodology is so important, so useful. So some of the methodology that we have adopted at Rakhigarhi, maybe I would like to show that. So Rakhigarhi, of course, this is the Harappan area, and Rakhigarhi is the biggest Harappan city, which is located here. You can see there are only 5 Harappan cities, of course. One is, of course, the site of Rakhigarhi, which is the biggest Harappan city now, spread over an area of almost 550 hectare. The next big city is Mohenjo-daro, which is around 300 hectare. Third big city is Harappa, which is around 200 hectare. Fourth is the site of Dholavira, which is recently, inscribed as a 40th World Heritage Site recently. And the fifth is the site of Ganveriwala, which is in the Cholistan part of Pakistan, which is not excavated. All other 4 Harappan metropolis, they have been excavated. So here, we tried the most of the methodologies that, I discussed. So this is the nature of the site. Those who have visited or those who have no idea, most of the ancient sites the habitation sites are in the form of low mounds, and they are mostly the whitish mounds because of maybe the internal process that happens. Because of that, the color of the soil becomes whitish. So in the Deccan region particularly, where we have black cotton soil, the whitish mounds pop out, and these are the ancient sites. And here also, of course, the surrounding soil also is whitish, in the Saraswati basin, and also in the Ganga plain. But still, the sites are quite, you can see in fact, this is the nature of the site. This is a low mound by the site of the village. And even the entire village, of course, is located, the whole village is located on ancient site. So this is all part of the ancient site. But this part, which is vacant, which is open, that is a part which is protected by the Archaeological Survey of India. So this part is protected, and this part is also protected by the Archaeological Survey of India. And this is how the nature of the mound looks like. The height depends upon how long the site was under occupation. If the duration is short, we do find very small deposit. Like at Valki, we had hardly 50 centimeter deposit because the duration there was very, very small. Whereas at Rakhigarhi, people have lived at one spot for nearly 3,000 or 4,000 years at one spot, because of the human activities, these type of thick mounds have formed. So we have worked on these. And these mounds contain the remains in the form of maybe their building structures, in the form of foundations, or the broken maybe remains like broken pottery, or maybe broken tools, broken ornaments. Most of the archaeological sites, are, they only have a very, very scanty data in them, because most of the sites are deserted. People leave the site and desert the site at some stage. And when they desert the site, they carry with them all the intact things, like their tools, their ornaments, even their vessels, etc. Only those things which are either broken or lost, they are only there. And archaeologists discovered these broken or lost things, and from these broken pots, we have to build a complete story. So this is a very Herculean task, and it is a task of a detective. We work like a detective, start asking many questions. So what is the first stage of the research on archaeological site is that we have to properly document the site and preserve the morphology of the site, because once the site is excavated, the original morphology of the site is destroyed, or it is distorted. And in order to preserve that, we prepare a contour map of the site. So we use total station survey and the latest geophysical instruments. We use that at the site of Rakhigarhi, and we have created these type of this 3D maps, contour maps of the site. We also have used the satellite photography imagery, which we analyze, and then of course we insert the 3D maps on the satellite photography imagery. And then we got the picture that the gray portion here represent the modern habitation, whereas the dark chocolate area represent the site which is visible now. So small portion of the site is visible or available, whereas large portion of the site is destroyed by the people, either that is under occupation or they have converted the site into agricultural field. So that is the process which is happening at many places in the country. So this is one important part which we completed first. And then that recently we also started using these two important geophysical methods which are very, very important. By using them, even though you do not excavate the site, you can extract a lot of information by using these techniques. So you can identify with different activity areas. You can identify maybe the area where you find maybe structures or the features, the area which is empty. So all that can be found out by using these two important methods. One is called electrical resistivity imaging survey. So we use in pattern the electric resistivity in pattern. This you can see that the rods are placed in the ground and they're connected by this wire, and we pass on in the current, and that current goes down up to maybe 3 meters or 4 meters. And whenever there is some maybe disturbance or any kind of hindrance, you get a different maybe pattern there or different map there. So by studying this, the diagrams that we get or we produce from these, by studying them, we can roughly estimate where are the structures, which is the area which is without structures, empty area, etc. So this is very important. That broadly different activity areas can be found out from that. And then of course this is called the GPR survey, ground penetration radar survey. A very, very important. This is a very small instrument, but very powerful instrument you can see here. So this instrument is used for scanning the whole site. It is like scanning our human body, in fact, in MRI scan. So the body, this body of the ancient site is scanned by maybe running this particular instrument on the site, and this instrument sends very strong infrared signals in the ground, and the signals can go down up to 20 to 25 meters. So you can actually come to know what type of remains are there up to the depth of 20 to 25 meters. So you get to know roughly maybe the size of the building, the nature of the maybe features or structures, the nature of maybe other maybe material culture at the site. So from once we study that the diagram that is produced from this scan, then we can identify the different activity areas. So without excavation, without spending a lot of funds, without destroying the site, you can actually collect a lot of information by using these techniques, which is very, very important. We have used them very successfully at the site of Rakhigarhi. We had a working station there, in fact, at Rakhigarhi. So we had this transmitter which sends signals in the ground, and we also have a receiver. The signals are received in this particular machine, which is sent to the control unit, and from control unit to our laptops or the computer unit. And then of course we get this type of diagrams, rather ECG type diagrams here. And wherever there is some structural feature, we get different diagram there. So we study this diagram, we interpret this diagram, and we make some presumption about what is the nature of the data there, nature of the evidence there, down there. So we study that, and then we try to make our hypothesis based on that. But then we studied, we did this. The other method that we adopted here, which is also equally important, is the sampling method. So you can see the grids on this, on the mounds which are visible. So we have gridded all the mounds which are visible, and we have put 5 meter by 5 meter grid there. And it is believed that whatever we find on the surface, those remains are very close to their original position. They are not really moved much away from their original position. So by studying the material lying on the surface, we can presume what is there in fact in the below the ground, immediately below the ground there. So if suppose there is a fire, maybe kill somewhere. So on the surface we might find maybe burnt lumps of clay. Maybe we might find pottery in different stages of firing, like maybe over-fired pottery or under-fired pottery or maybe vitrified pottery, etc. So that is the indication on the surface. So you can presume that maybe if that indication is there, then you can presume that there is a maybe pottery kiln below that. So that is how we can we identify that. So what we do in this, we uh, grade the whole area, and we collect all the material on the surface from each and every grid. It is recorded separately, it is analyzed separately, it is classified separately. Also, maybe a lot of scientific analysis is done separately. And then, we produce report of each and every, grid that we have studied. And then ultimately, it gives us a complete picture about maybe different activities carried out on the mound or on the site. So this is a very, very important method that we adopted, and very few archaeologists in the country, in fact, are following this particular method. But this is a very, very systematic method of sampling, and this gives you proper direction. So we first did this, and then we wanted to check, whether the hypothesis which is based on the surface collection is true or not. And then we carried out, these are some of the, these different activities that we identified. We found, maybe concentration of the structures here. We found manufacturing of maybe one activity here, manufacturing of some other activity here, manufacturing of pottery activity, etc. So these are the different activities that we could identify based on the classification and analysis of the objects and the data that we have collected from the site. So we got this. We also said that a particular part of the site was used for the manufacturing purpose, and then we wanted to check that hypothesis. There we carried out the excavation there, and we were we're surprised to see that exactly the corresponding evidence is found in the excavation. What we are seeing here are the platforms, working platforms, furnaces, and on these platforms at different levels. So they are all indicative of the manufacturing process in this area. And what is important, for the first time, which we brought to the notice, that we found these platforms, furnaces, one above the other. That means the craft was carried forward from one generation to another generation. So that means there is a hereditary succession of the craft activity during the Harappan times. So that evidence we found, and that evidence was excavated actually. So this hypothesis was made on the basis of surface collection, and that hypothesis came out to be true, exactly true, after the excavation was carried out there. And the data that was excavated, that proved that our hypothesis is correct. Then we wanted to understand the cultural process at the site. So you can see here complete sequence at the site from top to bottom. We took what we call as index range. So in the index range, generally index range is on the highest point of the mound. So we dig from top to the natural level up to bottom. And if there are number of different phases or cultures, that is reflected in this particular section. So this section can give us complete history of the site of the particular mound. So here we had early Harappan here, in fact, in the lower phase, and the Harappan civilization phase or the mature Harappan phase on top of that. And we also have found very good evidence about the transition from early Harappan to the mature Harappan, the transition in the structural activities, transition there in the technology, transition in their material culture. So we could really find out, how the transformation has taken place from early to mature, and the same phase is transformed into urban phase at some stage. So that could be found out because of this particular methodology that we adopted here. And then, of course, the main research that we did, of course, was the DNA research or the genetic research that we carried out at the site. Now, what we did here, in fact, let me tell you that before the site of Rakhigadi, I excavated one more site called Farmana just before the site of Rakhigadi. And one of my objectives at Farmana was to understand who are the Harappan people, because we had no idea. There are different hypotheses, different maybe maybe arguments about who are the people. Some say that they were indigenous people, some say that maybe they were people coming from outside, etc. So if you want to highlight or throw light on this particular aspect, the only way by which you can do is to extract DNA, study DNA, and study the genetic history of the people, and that will give you the clue. So we tried this method at the site of Farmana, but we failed there because we did not take, or we did not really take proper precaution there. Perhaps we did not understand that that the DNA is so sensitive. Our DNA, the DNA of the excavators can get into the DNA of the Harappan skeletal remains easily, and it will be mixed up, and it will be difficult in fact to detect which one is ancient and which one is modern. So, in fact, we did not take that precaution at Farmana, and therefore we did not succeed there. But later, we started collaborating with the scientists from Seoul National University in Korea, and they suggested that we have to take precaution for the excavation of the burial. So we introduced a new method of the excavation of burial. So here, you can see here, he looks like a Karuna warrior, but actually he's a burial warrior. So we use this, head cap, goggle, mask, disposal gown, disposal gloves, and we use also a separate, digging instrument for each burial. Same instrument was not repeated to other burials, so that we could minimize the contamination. So by using this, by doing this particular, maybe precaution, then we excavated the burials, all of us, in fact, the students, all of us, we excavated the burials, in this particular, way. This is a new method that we introduced for the first time in the country. And I suggest that those who want to excavate the burial site, they must take this type of precaution, because the contamination can happen easily, and we have to prevent that contamination at any cost. And this is one of the ways by which you can do that. So the burials were excavated by doing this, so that we could save them from any kind of contamination. These are some of the burials that we get. A typical Harappan burial, skeletal remains with some pots, or the burial goods we get. Harappans believed in life after death. Maybe they always thought that there is a second life, and therefore they have kept food and water in these pots. Also, we find their jewelry, sometimes their tools buried along with the dead bodies. So this is the kind of evidence that we got. Also, from the burials, we can try to identify the social and economic status of the individual, because the the quality and the quantity of the burial goods vary from burial to burial depending upon the status of the person. If the person's status is higher, maybe you find maybe high quality pottery and number of pots in the burials. If the status is not that high, you find low quality pottery and small number of pots in the burials. So this is the kind of evidence that we get, and this data was analyzed. Then also we did a lot of sampling also. The Koreans, they have successfully extracted parasite eggs from the ancient skeletal remains, and those skeleton those parasite eggs were studied, and they could detect DNA from the parasite eggs of different individuals there. So in our body, in everybody's body, there are parasite eggs in our stomach or in the lower part of the stomach. And after the death, the body gets disintegrated. But the parasite eggs can survive, and they can survive for many, maybe 100 years or 1,000 years. So we wanted to see whether we can collect some parasite eggs from the ancient burials at the Harappan cemetery, and therefore we have done this quite extensive sampling of the burials. And then of course the samples were transported to our lab in Deccan College, and then this is the procedure that we followed. As soon as the skeletal remains were brought, we first concentrated on studying the anthropological examination of the skeletal remains. So we have prepared this complete report of that. We have published that in a PLOS One. Then we have also done CT scanning, and the CT scan is very important for the reconstruction of the craniofacial or the 3D reconstruction of the dead body, how people looked like. And then of course we also did this paleoparasitology to find out whether we can get parasite eggs, and from that we can study the maybe DNA of the person. And then of course we did the sampling for two things. One, of course, for ancient DNA analysis, which we did successfully, and also we did these different analysis. The stable isotope analysis, these are the or very highly scientific specialized analysis that we did, and we took help of maybe various institutions, different institutions. We also took help of different scientists in doing this research. So from stable isotope, we can, and also from this strontium analysis, we can find out, what kind of food was eaten by the people. Also from this strontium analysis, even you can find out, what is the percentage of plant food and animal food in the diet. So that, that was done. Then, we do get a lot of pots in the burials, and we always suspected that, food or water was kept there. But then, we wanted to establish that by doing the residue analysis. Now, residue analysis is very, again, a specialized field. When anything is stored, any liquid is stored in the earthen pot, it forms a small thin layer inside the pot, and that layer can remain intact even after the pot is maybe clean. So generally, we scrape the inner portion of the pot, that is called the residue, and that residue analyze. So by analyzing that, we have established that the Indian curry, the antiquity of Indian curry goes back to the Harappan times, because in the residue analysis we found the ingredients of turmeric, also garlic, ginger, and eggplant, and these are the elements or the ingredients of the Indian curry. So Harappans were the first, in fact, to introduce Indian curry, and Indian curry is so popular all over the world today. Then also sometimes we also can use the starch grain analysis. A lot of the pounders or the saddle cones were used for grinding purpose, maybe different grains, or maybe different, maybe even spices were ground by these people. And when they're ground, maybe a small particle of that remains stuck to the either corn or the pounding stone. So that is extracted, that is studied, and we can reconstruct what type of maybe plant, maybe vegetables, or maybe plant, maybe even spices were available that time. So that is called the stage grade starch grain analysis. That was done, in fact, successfully here also. And then of course lipid profile analysis also very important. Lipid profile again studied, and the lipid profile varies from maybe fat to we study the fatty acid of the of the food, and particularly in case of animal it is very very pronounced, very visible. So the fatty acid was studied by this lipid profile analysis, and for the first time we have established that the Harappans were eating a lot of dairy products, because from this lipid profile we could find the traces of the dairy products being used by the Harappans. Milk, curd, cheese, even this and paneer. These are the products which were started by the Harappans. They were eaten by the Harappans. And also we found the this the profile of the some animals also, lipid profile of animals like sheep and goat, and even cattle, in fact, we found. So these were the part of the Harappan food. So these, it was possible to establish this because of the analysis that we undertook. And then, once the samples were brought to the laboratory, of course, now the same process was followed for cleaning them, because while cleaning also, the contamination might happen. So we have prevented that contamination also in the lab. And then, of course, once the samples were cleared, then, of course, we had collaboration with CCMB, Center for Cellular and Molecular Biology in Hyderabad. And there we carried out, this in their clean room, we did the sampling for DNA extraction. So the DNA was extracted. We did the sequencing of DNA there. We did the interpretation of that, and finally, we could publish that in fact in a very high-profile journal. And then lastly, this the scan. Why the scan is required? Now, for the reconstruction of the 3D profile of the people, we need two kinds of data. One is the matrix data, maybe the measurements of the bone, etc. That is very important. And the other one is the inner anatomy of individual. So the inner anatomy data can be produced by doing the MRI scan. So we did that MRI scan in fact in some hospitals in Pune, and that data was used. That data was fed in the computer, and then how this reconstruction was done step by step. In the first stage, the reconstruction of the skull was done. You can see, in the complete reconstruction was achieved here, and then slowly, the flesh and muscle were put on the body. There, maybe blood vessels were put, and finally the skin portion. And this is how the Harappan boy looked like. For the first time, we are shown to the world, in fact, how the Harappan people look like. This is an 18-year Harappan boy, and this is a 45-year Harappan woman, how they look like. And they look like exactly like the modern Haryana people there. So this is the kind of research that we did. And finally, that I would like to mention that, that the cultural heritage is so important. We have to make all out efforts for the protection and preservation of this heritage, not only for our posterity, but we can learn a lot from our heritage. Most of the Indian knowledge was developed by our ancient cultures, by the Harappans. And if we don't study that, perhaps we will not really understand how we have progressed till this date and how we have achieved this status today. And so that is one part. And also by systematically marketing this heritage, we can also generate a lot of revenue for the country. And that efforts also are being made in fact at the site of Rakhigarhi. So this is what we are doing in fact at the site of Rakhigarhi. So there is a lot to tell, but what is important here that if your research methodology is robust, you can produce a very good, completely innovative research, and the results can be really innovative, completely different. And that is possible only when we take care of our research methodology properly. Everything in fact, the collection of data is very important here. The analysis of the data is important. Interpretation of data is important. And then, we can draw the meaningful conclusions from that. So hopefully, all of you, will try to follow this methodology. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Shall we take some questions, sir?
Yeah, sure, no problem.
All right. Any questions? You may unmute yourself and ask questions if you have any.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Yeah, this is Siddesh, sir, from Karnataka.
Yes, please.
So I have a question, sir.
Yes.
Is there any relation between the DNA testing and the RNA invasion theory to rule out the RNA invasion theory, sir?
See what we are getting. We have done the this DNA of the of the people for last 12,000 years.
Okay.
We have collected samples from different parts of South Asia, also from Iran and Turkmenistan also.
Okay.
And what we found that that our that around 10,000 BCE,
Yes, sir.
the hunter-gatherers around 12,000 years, we were in hunting I think stage.
Yeah.
The hunter-gatherers, they broke into two groups. One group went to Iran, and they got mixed up with the Anatolian people there. And one group came to South Asia. And the group which came to South Asia, they started developing its own very distinct South Asian ancestry or genetic history.
Okay.
And that genetic history, which was developed maybe around 10,000 BCE, that continues till Harappan times. And from Harappan times, the same genetic history continues till modern times, till present.
Okay.
We have analyzed the modern population, nearly 3,500 people from 140 different groups.
Okay.
And these groups include people of different religions, people of different caste, creed, etc. And we found
sir.
that most of the people from Andaman Nicobar to Kashmir and from Afghanistan to Bengal, most of them have Harappan ancestry in them. More than
Okay.
when we have more than 25 to 30% of ancestry of one group, then that means we are descendants of that group. And then the remaining, of course, is mixed up because right from the beginning of the settled life, we were in contact with people from maybe West Asia, from Central Asia, from even far South Asia, etc. So we were trading with them. So naturally, there was a lot of interaction happening. So mixing was happening that time also. But the
Okay.
South Asia ancestry has not been broken or discontinued for last 10,000 years. That means nobody came from outside and
Yeah.
tried to kill these people here and dislodge the local population. That is very important. So from that, we can rule out, even though people have come, maybe, so-called Aryans, some people may have come, but they were absorbed in the society here and they
Okay.
have not replaced the local population. So that is
Okay.
very important evidence that we get.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Anybody else?
Yeah, Ikram, can I have a question?
Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor Shinde, for such a wonderful and informative lecture. I would just have a small question, which just points out to the present state of affairs with regard to the politics of archaeology. This is it's amazing how you presented. The research you have done on so many sites. I just wanted to, get a view of it. How do you balance the kind of politics which is done around archaeology, and then come out with such wonderful research and be able to successfully come out with such a balanced and such rigorous informative and meaningful conclusions? Just your view, sir.
I think it is important that that being historian or archaeologist, you have to be true to the to the evidence that we produce.
Professional. Yes.
And whatever evidence we produce, suppose that evidence is properly analyzed, and if the scientific data is produced in front of to the people, they will accept that. And then once you have data with you, scientific data with you, then perhaps you can also go next stage further, and you can try to interpret the data and put forth that interpretation to the people. And I don't think that people, once you have very strong maybe archaeological data, genetic data, and textual data, people will not reject that. So we should learn to provide the factual data to the people, and that will certainly help you. Nobody can negate that. Nobody can argue with that data. So that is very, very important lesson that we have to learn from this type of research.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Anybody else?
Sir, it's
Yeah,
a great day to us, sir.
Yeah, please.
Sir, did you feel any physical difference, the height difference of the people of the Agigeri, just compared to the present man?
No, exactly. For last 10,000 years, there is absolutely no difference in the anatomy of the people for last 10,000 years. Maybe in some region like Haryana, Punjab, people are slightly taller. In Deccan, South India, people are not that tall. The complexion varies from region to region, but that complexion has nothing to do with the genetic history. Even though the South Indians and the North Indians have the same genetic history, because of maybe the geographical factor, climatic factor, food habit, these different complexes come into existence. Because of that, we have such a variation in fact in the country, because we have such a varied climatic condition, ecological condition, food habits are varied. Because of that, these different ecological, different compilations come into existence. And then second, how much mixing is happening from different regions. It also affects that. So because of that, these different compilations come into existence. So genetic history has nothing to do with that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We can take one more question. I think we don't have any more questions, sir.
Why is that? That Bhutan period? Sir, audible?
Yes, go on.
Sir? Why is that Gusana's period in a golden age? Give an example, sir.
Sorry, can you repeat your question?
Why is that Gusana's period, golden ages in ancient history? Give one some examples, sir.
No. See, when R.S. Sharma analyzed the data, the archaeological data, he found that there is a very, very rich archaeological evidence in the Kushan period compared to the Gupta period. Gupta period is relatively poor compared to Kushan period. So most of the developments in terracotta art, maybe development in jewelry, development in architecture was done in fact in the Kushan period itself. And then the Gupta people have just followed that. So that means that Kushan period was much more prosperous than the Gupta period. That is the conclusion drawn by Professor R.S. Sharma based on his research and the use of two important sources, the textual sources and the archaeological sources. So on the basis of archaeological sources, it does not prove that Gupta was a golden age. Rather, Kushan appears to be more prosperous than the Gupta age. And therefore, he said that Gupta may be considered as the golden age in ancient Indian history. Is that
Thank
clear?
you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. And I must say that, yes, Jai Shri Ram Kumar, you want to say something?
Yes, sir. Sir, I'm just curious to know your take on Keeladi excavations that's happening in Tamil Nadu, sir. Any points on that?
Keeladi is a classical site of the early historic period. There was a lot of debate on this, and we know that the beginning is going back to maybe 2nd century BC, at the most 3rd century BC, and that is the beginning of the second urbanization in this part of the world, in this part of the country. So we have a lot of sites like Keeladi in the Deccan region in South India also, which indicate the beginning of the urbanization in South India or in Deccan region. So it is not a unique or different site as such, but it is a part of the the process that was happening in the early historic period in this part of the country.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Professor Shinde, sir. Thank you so much. It was such an informative and entertaining lecture, I would say, because you showed some wonderful slides. I personally feel that I have never been on excavation sites and I didn't know what actually goes on in the field during the excavation, and it was wonderful to see that. And with the advancement in technology and how the archaeologists and historians and different social scientists and scientists, they are collaborating in order to reach and try to make sense of the past. It was wonderful, and I would maybe I would request Dr. Danish Moin to say a few words and maybe thank Professor Shinde. Sir, before all of you sign off, I would request you to stay with me for a while after Danish sir speaks, because we want to make a couple of announcements. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Ikram. Shinde Saab, you simply hypnotize us. I mean, the way you deliver your lecture, it was wonderful.
It's a pleasure, in
And,
fact.
and everybody enjoyed. I mean, the way you said, because he is the man who taught me how to hold a pottery once he was excavating in Junnar. So I had an opportunity to learn something from Professor Shinde. It's very, I'm honored that you have accepted our invitation. Thank you very much, sir. I am
So kind of you, Dr.
I am
Jani.
delighted. I am delighted. Thank you very much.
Pleasure, really. Yes.
Thank you
pleasure.
so much, sir, for being with us today. Thank you.
So I can leave, Ikram? I can leave?
Yes, you can leave, and Professor Shinde, if he wants to leave, he can also leave.
Okay.
then we'll have some discussion with the participants. Thank
Yeah,
you so much, sir.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure, talking to all of you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll speak
Yeah,
to you in
thank
the
you.
evening. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
All right. I just wanted to make a couple of announcements, not announcement per se, but I thought that maybe I was thinking if it is possible for me to involve some of you more actively. So I thought that from tomorrow onwards, and if not tomorrow, maybe day after tomorrow, I will assign some of you responsibility to introduce some resource persons and maybe give vote of thanks or thank the resource persons in the end. I will tell you in advance who to introduce, who is going to introduce who, and who is going to thank who. So if some of you wants to volunteer, you can volunteer and you can suggest your name in the WhatsApp group. I can take note of it. And if not, then maybe I can identify a few people who are very active and asking questions. I can request them to take over the floor. Is that fine with you?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's fine.
All
This is
right.
wonderful
All right. So
session and that was thinking.
Yeah, we're going to do this. We are going to have a rotation kind of a policy where I would maybe request some of you to introduce the speaker and then give vote of thanks in the end.
Excuse me, sir.
So, yes.
So we will be providing the details of that resource person, no, sir, before.
No, that is the challenge, my dear friend. You will have to find it.
Okay, no problem, sir. We can do it.
Yes.
No problem.
I mean, see, the CV of the resource persons generally are available on the websites or of the institution where they teach, or it is generally available online. If you are not able to find it, you can request. I can provide it to you.
Yes, sir.
And for vote of thanks, it's not a big deal because if I tell you in the beginning of the lecture, maybe you listen to the lecture patiently and then in the end you can speak for a minute and thank the speaker. That is how it is going to work. And I believe that this mechanism will give some of you a chance maybe to interact with the speaker more frankly.
Yes, sir.
I wish you all the best. It was a great day. So please come back tomorrow at 10 o'clock sharp. And one more thing, I would just request you to join at least 5 or 10 minutes before, because if you join late, your notification pops on my screen. And then if I'm introducing the speaker at the same time, I'll have to take you in. And it becomes very challenging for me to manage both at the same time. So it would be good if you join at least 5 minutes before so that it goes hassle free. Is that all right? Is there any question, clarification, any query?
No, sir. No, sir.
No, sir.
All right.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.